Unconventional foods people ate during the Civil War. When people think of Civil War food, they picture hardtack, salt pork, and coffee. That's the surface. Beneath that surface lies a universe of improvisation, desperation, and forgotten knowledge. This isn't a story about recipes. It's about the human drive to fill a stomach when the normal world has collapsed. We are talking about substitutions that became staples, famine foods that kept a pulse going, and the grim ingenuity born from blockades, ravaged farmland, and supply chains that simply ceased to exist. This account covers both sides. The Confederacy, slowly strangled by the Union blockade, experienced the most radical dietary shifts. But Union soldiers under siege, prisoners of war in places like Andersonville and Elmira, and civilians in border states torn apart by guerrilla warfare all faced their own versions of emptiness. The unconventional foods they turned to fall into categories: botanical substitutions, animal matter usually considered waste or vermin, industrial byproducts, soil-based minerals, and, in the most extreme cases, a retreat into pure, desperate invention. The core problem: the collapse of staples. To understand the unconventional, you must understand the conventional absence. The Southern diet before the war was corn-heavy, supplemented with pork, some greens, and wheat for the wealthy. Coffee was universal. Sugar was a daily necessity for many. Salt was non-negotiable for preserving meat. When the war cut off imports and destroyed farmland, these pillars crumbled first. Coffee vanished behind the blockade. Real coffee became worth its weight in gold. Soldiers and civilians couldn't simply quit caffeine, nor did they want to give up the ritual warmth. This single absence spawned an entire subculture of ersatz coffee experimentation. People tried roasting and grinding every brown, seed-like thing they could find. Acorns, stripped of tannins through boiling and leaching, became a base. Rye grain, when it could be spared from bread, was scorched in skillets. Sweet potatoes were sliced, dried until hard as bone, roasted until nearly carbonized, and pounded into a dark powder. Okra seeds, dried and roasted, produced a slick, earthy brew that some came to prefer. Chicory root, already known in Europe, became a salvation for those near ports where it could be smuggled in, mixed with the last dwindling real coffee stores. Watermelon seeds, carefully saved, were roasted and ground. Even cottonseed, a truly desperate measure given its natural toxins, was experimentally roasted by some before the dangers became widely known. The resulting drinks were bitter, burnt, and thin, but they were hot and dark and carried the ghost of coffee's comfort. Salt was a strategic material. Without it, meat rotted, and humans who lose sodium through sweat and labor developed lethargy, cramps, and a gnawing, specific hunger that normal food couldn't touch. The conventional salt sources, like the mines in Louisiana and the saltworks on the coasts, became battlegrounds. Civilians and soldiers far from these sources dug up the dirt from smokehouse floors, where years of brine drippings had saturated the earth. This dirt was put in barrels, water was poured through it, and the resulting brine was boiled down to reclaim a gray, mineral-tasting salt residue. Others scraped the evaporated residue from the inside of old meat barrels. In mountainous regions, natural salt licks, previously used for livestock, suddenly became vital human gathering points, often dangerously close to enemy lines. Wheat flour became a luxury item. The Confederate Army's official ration dwindled. Cornmeal, the obvious substitute, itself became scarce as armies trampled fields and burned barns. The search for bread extenders and flour substitutes became obsessive. Rice flour was used where rice was grown, adding a gritty, brittle structure to bread. Fine cornmeal was the standard, but the coarse, unbolted meal, where the hard hulls remained, scraped the digestive tract. People ground dried field peas, the ones normally fed to animals, into a heavy, greenish meal that baked into a dense, brick-like loaf. In urban areas under siege, like Vicksburg, the last reserves of anything even vaguely starch-based were commandeered. The dried pith of corn cobs was ground and sifted. People pulverized dried sweet potatoes into a sugary flour that browned quickly. The root of the kudzu plant, a Japanese import that was just beginning its silent invasion of the South, was dug up and processed for its pure white starch, used to thicken soups or make a translucent, gelatinous porridge. Sugar disappeared. The cane fields were often battlefields or cut off from refineries. The sorghum plant became the savior of the sweet tooth. Sorghum cane, a tall grass, was grown in small plots. The juice was pressed out through rudimentary roller mills, often powered by a mule walking in a circle. This green juice was boiled down in open kettles, a process that demanded constant skimming of green scum, until it became a dark, viscous syrup with a metallic, grassy, slightly bitter sweetness. It wasn't just a topping. It became the primary sweetener for everything, poured over cornbread, mixed into ersatz coffee, used to preserve fruits, and fermented into a crude, hangover-inducing liquor. Honey from wild bee trees became a fiercely sought-after resource, with men risking enemy patrols to fell a tree and claim the combs, often eating the entire thing raw, wax, bee brood, and all. The botanical frontier, eating the wild and the waste. When gardens were raided and fields burned, the line between food and non-food among plants blurred permanently. The knowledge held by enslaved people, poor rural whites, and indigenous communities about wild edibles became a life-or-death currency. Kudzu, beyond its root starch, was consumed entirely. The young leaves and vine tips were boiled like spinach, a preparation that required multiple changes of water to remove bitterness. The blossoms, purple and fragrant, were dipped in a sorghum water batter and fried into fritters, or used to make a jelly that tasted faintly of grapes. The common blackberry and its leaves were elevated from a casual snack to a critical resource. The fruit was eaten raw, dried like leather, or fermented into wine. The leaves, dried and crushed, became one of the most successful tea substitutes, a practice so widespread that soldiers on both sides would automatically scan hedgerows for the distinctive bramble. This tea, rich in tannins, was astringent and somewhat medicinal, and was used to treat dysentery, a far greater killer than bullets. Sassafras trees were dug up not for the root, but for the bark of the root, the part with the highest concentration of saffrole oil. This was boiled to make a deep red, aromatic tea that tasted like root beer without the sugar. It was considered a spring tonic, a blood purifier, and a general preventative. The young, mucilaginous leaves of the sassafras were dried and pounded into a powder called file, a Choctaw invention adopted by Louisiana Creoles. When meat stalks dried up entirely, a thin soup of foraged greens could be given body and a slippery, satisfying texture with a dusting of file. Acorns from white oaks, which have less tannin, were a massive undertaking. They were shelled, pounded into a coarse meal, and put into a cloth sack. This sack was placed in a running stream or repeatedly leached with boiling water to draw out the bitter, constipating tannic acid. The resulting bland, gritty paste was dried and pounded again into a flour. This acorn flour had no gluten, so it couldn't rise, but fried into flat cakes or mixed with a little cornmeal, it provided a survival bread that was rich in fat and calories. The lowly pokeweed, a toxic plant demanding specific knowledge, was a spring staple in areas stripped bare. Only the very young shoots, before the stalk turned red, were safe. They were gathered, parboiled in one pot of water, the water discarded, and parboiled again in fresh water. The resulting cooked green, known as poke salad, was eaten with a splash of smoky, re-reclaimed salt brine water and, if anyone had it, a precious drop of bacon grease. The deep purple berries were used to dye cloth and, in a risky move, added to low-quality wine for color, though the seeds are toxic. Things normally thrown away or fed to pigs became everyday fare. Corn shucks, the papery outer leaves, were not just for tamales. They were thoroughly washed, boiled for hours until they began to disintegrate, and then the fibrous mass was ground. This greenish, stringy pulp was mixed with cornmeal as an extender. Peach tree leaves, which contained trace amounts of cyanogenic compounds, were boiled for tea by the truly desperate, creating a brew with a bitter almond scent and a real potential for sickness. Watermelon rinds, the thick white part, were not just pickled. They were peeled, cubed, and stewed for a long time with sorghum and spices like sassafras bark to make a mock candied fruit, or simply boiled soft and mashed into a wet paste with cornmeal. Pea hulls from field peas, normally thrown to the hogs, were boiled, mashed, and sieved to create a thin, starchy puree that could be drunk like a soup. The animal kingdom wasted, no creature too low. The blockade starved the South of more than just luxuries. It created a protein famine. Hogs and cattle, when available, were driven to army depots. What was left for civilians and soldiers on the margins was a menu of animals and animal parts previously considered inedible or entirely beneath notice. The feral hog, or razorback, was the South's emergency larder. These were not the fat, docile farm pigs but lean, wild, dangerously tusked animals that had gone feral in the woods for generations. Hunting them was a violent necessity. The meat was tough, stringy, and gamey, lacking the sweet fat of a corn-fed hog. Every scrap was used. The skin, instead of being scalded and scraped for pork rinds, was often singed of its hair over an open fire, cut into squares, and boiled for many hours until it dissolved into a gelatinous, protein-rich sludge, flavored with anything available, wild garlic, peppergrass, or just reclaimed salt. Organ meats, often the privilege of enslaved people in peacetime, became universal. Chitlins, the small intestines of the hog, were cleaned with a stick and endless buckets of water, a task of physical and olfactory endurance. They were then boiled until tender, sometimes dredged in cornmeal if any could be spared, and fried. The result was a chewy, strongly flavored meat. Pigs' feet were scalded, scraped, and boiled into a sticky, collagen-rich stew. Heads were cleaved in half, the brains removed for frying, and the rest, ears, snout, jowls, went into a giant kettle to boil until the meat fell from the bone and could be pressed into a loaf called head cheese or souse, a gray, jellied mass of meat and cartilage held together with its own gelatin. Cow heel, a bony, stringy cut, was boiled for an entire day to create a similar stew. Marrow from cracked beef and pork bones was scooped out and spread like butter on hardtack. Small game and vermin acquired new status. Possum was captured alive and penned, fed on scraps for a few weeks to try to clean out the carrion taste of its wild diet. Then it was killed, skinned, and roasted, usually with sweet potatoes if possible, as the fat and sweet potato together created a passable dish. The fat was rendered and saved as a cooking grease with a distinct, musty odor. Raccoon was treated similarly. The musk glands, located under the legs and along the spine, had to be carefully removed during skinning, or the entire carcass would be tainted with a rank, indelible flavor. Squirrel, particularly the gray squirrel, was a common pot meat stewed into a tough, dark meat pie or dumpling stew. The brains of squirrels, a delicacy in some pre-war communities, were eaten raw or fried. Groundhog was dug from its burrow, often by smoking it out, and its fatty, gamey meat was roasted. The groundhog's thick hide, with its subcutaneous fat layer, was valued for greasing boots and frying pans as much as for eating. Birds on the margins of appetite were taken. Crows and blackbirds were shot and made into pie, a dish that required many birds and yielded little meat, which was invariably black, strong, and musky. Robins were trapped and eaten in a single, crunchy bite. Even songbirds, like the bobolink or ricebird, were netted in huge numbers and roasted on sticks. What soldiers called kush, or Confederate kush, was a field improvisation with a base of beef, usually the poorest, gristliest cuts from a tired artillery horse or commissary steer. The beef was cut into tiny cubes and fried in bacon grease or tallow until it was hard, dark pellets. Water was added to the frying pan with the meat, along with crumbled hardtack or coarse cornmeal. This was stirred until it became a thick, greasy, lumpy porridge. It was a complete, life-sustaining meal in a single pan, tasting of hard fat, burnt meat, and whatever the water source had to offer. Fish were caught not just with hooks but with bare hands, clubs, and even by muddying the water. Garfish, a heavily armored, prehistoric-looking fish of southern rivers, was considered a trash fish. Its roe was toxic to mammals. But starving men broke open its armored scales, pulled out the long, boneless backstraps, and either roasted them or ground the tough, white meat into balls mixed with cornmeal and fried. Eels, caught in freshwater streams, were skinned, cut into chunks, and fried in their own copious, oily fat. Catfish were pulled from muddy ponds, their flesh tasting of the algae-rich water. Small fish, minnows and shiners, were not cleaned but eaten whole, fried crisp in a pan. In coastal areas, whelks and periwinkles, tiny sea snails usually ignored, were boiled from their shells with a pin. Turtles of all kinds, box turtles from the woods, snapping turtles from the swamps, and terrapins from the marshes were a messy salvation. A snapping turtle was killed by cutting off its head, then the bottom shell was removed, the entrails scooped out, and the meat, a complex anatomy of different textures and colors, was stewed into a rich, gelatinous soup. The eggs of turtles, found buried in sandy banks, were a windfall of rich, oily yolks that never set firmly when boiled. The relationship with insects was purely transactional. The grubs found inside rotting logs, the large, fat larvae of beetles, were collected and fried in an old canteen half. They sizzled and popped, turning from white to brown, tasting nutty and creamy. In sieges where nothing else moved, these grubs were protein. Honeybees provided not just honey but the brood, the wax comb filled with larval bees. This comb was chewed raw, swallowing the waxy, protein-filled grubs along with the honey. It was a complete food, prepackaged. The industrial and the unthinkable, the war's deepest hunger. As the war ground on, the unconventional shifted from the wild and the wasted to the processed and the perilous. This was the frontier of industrial food modification and outright chemical desperation, seen most starkly in besieged cities and prison camps. In the cities under siege, particularly Vicksburg, the food system collapsed entirely. Mule and horse meat, initially scorned, became the premium protein. A mule steak, cut from the flank of a worn-out army animal, was described by those who could still be objective as tasting slightly sweet, coarser than beef, but entirely acceptable when fried in its own rendered tallow and sprinkled with the scraped salt residue from a barrel. The sight of a butcher selling a recognizable mule roast was a sign of normalcy compared to what came next. When the mules ran out, the rats became the market. Norway rats, which infested the trenches and ruined warehouses, were trapped by children and sold to soldiers and civilians. The going rate was $1 or more per rat. The preparation was specific: shoot or trap the rat, skin it immediately, remove the entrails thoroughly, soak the carcass in water with a splash of vinegar or wild onion juice if possible, then skewer and broil it over a hot fire until the flesh was firm and the skin crackled. Survivors said it tasted like squirrel, which was a compliment. In the Confederate Army, the issue of meat spoilage in the southern heat led to a tolerance for decay that would be unthinkable today. Sowbelly, the salt pork ration, was often handed out crawling with maggots or stinking of advanced rancidity. The men scraped off the maggots, wiped the meat with a rag, and threw it into the skillet. The cooking process killed the remaining life and somewhat masked the taste of putrefaction with the taste of char fried. The maggots that remained would pop and jump in the pan, a spectacle that became so common it was met with grim jokes rather than disgust. Coffee water was used to boil the meat, the acidity and strong flavor helping to make it palatable. Hardtack, the dense flour and water cracker, was often infested with weevils. Soldiers would tap the cracker on the table, and if the weevils didn't move, that meant they were dead and could be eaten as extra protein. If they moved, the cracker was soaked in coffee, and the weevils, floating to the surface, were skimmed off before the soft, sodden mass was eaten. Prison camps represented the absolute bottom of the food hierarchy. At Andersonville, the official ration, when it existed, was a small amount of uncooked cornmeal, some black beans filled with weevils, and perhaps a pinch of dirty salt. The hunger was so absolute that men would fight over the offal from the prison cookhouse, the scraped guts of whatever animal was being butchered for the guards. Men gnawed on bones discarded by others, bones that had already been boiled multiple times. They chewed leather, shoe uppers, cartridge box straps, belts, trying to extract the last molecule of animal fat from the tanning process. They boiled and reb-oiled leather until it made a foul-smelling jelly. They ate the bark from the pine trees within the stockade, the inner cambium layer that is somewhat nutritious, until the trees were girdled and dead, a denuded forest of white, bare trunks. They dug for roots with their bare hands, eating any tuber or rhizome they could find, sometimes poisoning themselves with unknown plants. Clay eating, or geophagy, became rampant. A specific type of white clay, kaolin, was dug from the earth and eaten. It had no caloric value. It filled the stomach, deceived the nerves of hunger for a brief, terrible time, and often led to fatal intestinal blockages. This was the point where the will to survive had reduced food to its most basic function, a physical sensation of fullness, a momentary cessation of the pain. The unconventional foods of the Civil War are a ledger of human tenacity. On one side of the ledger is the incredible retrieval of buried knowledge, the way people remembered how to process acorns, where to find sassafras, and how to render a feral hog into a winter's worth of sustenance. There is a botanical and zoological inventiveness that is genuinely remarkable, a complete reimagining of the edible landscape. On the other side is a descent into a purely biological imperative. The rat on the stick, the chewed leather, the stomach full of white clay. These are not food in any cultural sense. They are the body's raw, desperate commands overriding every learned disgust. This trajectory, from hardtack to weevil-filled beans to kaolin clay, is the war's true culinary story. It's a story not of recipes lost and found, but of the slow, systematic stripping away of the very idea of cuisine, until all that is left is the mechanism of a body trying to fuel itself for one more day of a war that seems without end. Regional craters and hidden larders. The story of unconventional food isn't uniform across the Confederacy or the border states. Geography dictated desperation. A soldier in the Shenandoah Valley had different options than a civilian in blockaded Charleston or a guerrilla fighter in the Missouri borderlands. The landscape itself became a menu, but one written in a language of specific, local knowledge. The coastal salt marsh larder. From the Carolina Lowcountry to the Florida Panhandle, the salt marshes and tidal creeks provided a larder that the blockade couldn't touch. This wasn't the plantation diet of rice and pork. This was a turn to the estuarine ecosystem, the mud and the cordgrass. The blue crab, normally a casual food, became a staple protein. When nets and traps were unavailable, people used chicken necking, tying a string around a scrap of rancid meat or a smashed whelk and dragging it through the water. Crabs, holding on with their claws, were pulled to the surface and netted. The crabs were boiled in seawater for saltiness and eaten completely, the soft gills, the mustard, or hepatopancreas, the tiny bits of meat in the legs. Nothing was discarded. The shells were pounded and boiled for a thin, briny broth that was used to cook grits or rice. Shrimp, small and abundant, were caught with cast nets or even fine mesh grain sieves repurposed as seines. These tiny shrimp, including the heads, shells, and legs, were dried in the sun on sheets of tin or wooden boards. This dried mass, called shrimp dust by some, was pounded into a coarse, pinkish-gray powder. It was intensely salty, fishy, and rich in calcium from the shells. A spoonful of shrimp dust in a pot of boiling water, along with whatever greens could be foraged, made a protein-rich soup. Mixed with cornmeal, it created a savory, oceanic hoe cake that tasted strongly of the marsh. Marsh hens, particularly the clapper rail, were a secret food of the coast. These thin, laterally compressed birds were difficult to shoot and offered little meat. They were hunted at night during high tides, poling a flatboat through the cordgrass with a lantern. The birds, confused by the light, would freeze or fly directly at the flame, where they were knocked down with a stick. The meat, dark and fishy tasting from their diet of fiddler crabs and snails, was tough. The standard preparation was to skin the bird, cut it into pieces, and stew it for hours with rice and the peppery leaves of the smartweed plant, which grew in the same marshes. This was rail stew, a dish that bridged the gap between survival and cuisine. Oysters, in the estuaries of the Chesapeake and the Carolina Sounds, were no longer an appetizer. They were a daily bread. Oyster beds were raided at low tide by people wading into the cold water with buckets. The oysters were roasted in the shell over coals, steamed in pits lined with hot rocks, or opened raw. The liquor was saved, a briny, nutrient-dense broth. Oysters were chopped and added to cornmeal stuffing, dried over smoky fires for preservation, and, in a strange mutation, pickled in a brine made from boiled seawater, wild juniper berries, and a splash of stolen vinegar. In Richmond, when meat was scarce, a pie made of oysters, crumbled hardtack, and the gelatinous stock from boiled pig's feet was passed off as a luxury. The Piedmont and mountain subsistence shift. Away from the coast, in the rolling hills of Georgia, the Carolinas, and Virginia, and into the mountains of Tennessee and Kentucky, the unconventional diet leaned heavily on the chestnut tree and the wild greens of the forest floor. The American chestnut, not yet blighted, was a keystone species, both for the ecosystem and for human survival. Chestnuts were gathered in the fall in massive quantities, an activity that was a communal event before the war and became a frantic, solitary race during it. The nuts were not just roasted. They were boiled, peeled, and mashed into a sweet, crumbly paste. This paste was dried in cakes and could be stored for months. When reconstituted with water or milk from a cow that hadn't been taken, it became a porridge. Ground into a flour, chestnut meal was heavy, sweet, and didn't rise, but fried in a pan with bear grease, rendered from bears hunted in the deep woods, it made a dense, cake-like bread. The nuts were also buried in pits lined with leaves to sweat and ferment slightly, a Cherokee and Muskogee technique that preserved them and made them sweeter. This fermented chestnut mash was pounded into a thick paste and used as a flavoring for wild game stews, adding a sour, fruity depth. Wild greens in the mountains went far beyond poke salad. Lamb's quarters, or wild spinach, was a mild green that grew in disturbed soil around abandoned cabins and fields. It required no special preparation, just boiling. Amaranth, a tall weed with a red seed head, provided both greens and a tiny, high-protein seed that could be shaken into porridge. Nettles, the stinging plant, were gathered with thick gloves made of rags. Boiling destroyed the sting completely. The resulting liquid was a deep green tea, rich in minerals. The boiled nettles themselves, tasting slightly like spinach and sea air, were chopped and mixed with a small amount of cornmeal to make nettle pudding, a savory, iron-rich dish. Watercress, growing in cold mountain springs, was eaten raw as a salad when safe from contamination, providing a peppery bite and a crucial source of vitamins. The pawpaw tree, which grows in the understory of hardwood forests, provided the Indiana banana, or poor man's banana. The fruit, ripe in late summer, is soft, custardy, and tastes like a mix of mango and banana. It was eaten raw, scooped from the skin. It was also fermented into a potent, sweet-tasting brandy or just left to rot into a fizzy, alcoholic pulp that was drunk. Pawpaw seeds, large and toxic, were never eaten, but the fruit's high caloric density and sugar content made it a critical survival food in the Western Mountains. Charleston, Richmond, and the siege economy. Inside the blockaded cities, the unconventional food system was a bizarre hybrid of the wild, the repurposed, and the outright fraudulent. The city markets, once a riot of produce and meat, became museums of deprivation. In Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, the starvation parties of the elite were a macabre social event. Young women and men would gather to dance and socialize, and the refreshments would be nothing, literally nothing but water and perhaps a single, shared bowl of sorghum syrup with a bit of cornbread. The pretense of normalcy was maintained at the cost of any actual food. The city's restaurant culture adapted. Establishments served stone soup, a thin, hot liquid flavored with whatever could be found, a beef bone boiled for the 50th time, a handful of wild onions, a sprinkle of shrimp dust from the coast. Coffee houses sold cups of pure chicory, or chicory mixed with roasted peanuts, at exorbitant prices. The meat in pies was often a mystery, a finely minced amalgam that could be rat, alley cat, or, if one was lucky, old mutton from a diseased sheep. It was heavily spiced with peppergrass and mustard seeds to hide its origins. The rice fields around Charleston were a battlefield of their own. The rice itself was controlled by the government and speculators. The enslaved population on the sea islands and the poor whites in the city turned to the volunteer rice, the grains that fell from the harvested stalks and grew wild in the ditches and marsh edges. This was small, weedy rice, often mixed with wild grasses. It was laborious to harvest, dehusk by hand, and winnow, but it was rice. They also harvested the seeds of the cordgrass itself, tiny, hard grains that were pounded into a dark, bitter flour. This was the food of people who were being starved not just by the blockade, but by the deliberate policies of their own government, which prioritized feeding the army over feeding the enslaved population. In Mobile and Wilmington, the last ports to be closed, the unconventional food trade became an art of smuggling. The blockade runners, swift steamships, brought in luxuries for the rich, but the mass of people depended on small, shallow draft boats that slipped out at night to the Gulf Stream or the Atlantic to fish for deep-sea species that were salted and traded. But a more immediate resource was the sea turtle, specifically the green turtle, which was still abundant. A captured turtle could weigh hundreds of pounds. Its capture was a community event. The meat, particularly the greenish fat, was a delicacy. The callipee, the cartilage from the underside, was boiled into a clear, gelatinous soup. But the truly unconventional use was the eggs, which were systematically harvested from nesting beaches under cover of darkness, a dangerous operation in contested coastal zones. The eggs, with their leathery shells and yolks that remain liquid when cooked, were a source of rich fat and protein that bypassed the blockaded ports entirely. The fermentation of desperation. When fresh food disappeared, preservation went primitive and strange. Fermentation, which pre-war was for pickles and sauerkraut, became a primary means of rendering marginal foods edible and creating new, sometimes dangerous, nutritional sources. Corn was not just ground for meal. It was the base for a vast, informal alcohol economy. Soldiers and civilians alike fermented a gruel of cornmeal and sorghum syrup into a sour, low-alcohol beer, drunk while still actively fermenting and bubbling. This corn beer was a way to extract B vitamins and make caloric water, and its mild intoxicating effect was a crucial psychological escape. More potent was the distillation of this beer into corn liquor, a clear, harsh spirit that was drunk raw or used to extract the medicinal and psychoactive properties of plants. Soldiers would soak the bark of the willow tree, a natural painkiller, in corn liquor to make a crude analgesic. They would steep Jimson weed, a dangerous hallucinogen, to a state of wild intoxication. Meat, when available in sporadic, large quantities, like a hog killed by a foraging party, had to be preserved without sufficient salt. Smoke became the solution. The meat was cut into thin strips and hung inside a makeshift smokehouse, often just a barrel or a lean-to covered in blankets, where a smoldering fire of green hickory or corn cobs produced thick, acrid smoke. The result was a blackened, leather-hard product that was insect-resistant and intensely smoky, tasting more of the fire than the animal. But it kept. It was shaved into soup, chewed raw like a tobacco plug, or pounded with cornmeal into a paste. The true frontier of unconventional fermentation was in the creation of ersatz vinegars and acids. With apple orchards ruined, the craving for sour flavors, a biological signal for necessary acidity and vitamin C, was met with bizarre substitutions. Water from boiled corn shucks was left to sour naturally in a crock, creating a thin, slightly tangy liquid used to dress foraged greens. The dregs of sorghum syrup barrels were mixed with water and left to ferment past the beer stage into a harsh, acetic brew. In the mountains, wild grapes, small and intensely tart, were crushed, watered down, and left to become a sharp, pinkish vinegar substitute. This need for acid was not a luxury. It was a direct response to the dreary, alkaline monotony of a diet of plain cornmeal and overcooked greens, and a desperate attempt to stave off scurvy, which began to appear not just in prisons but in army camps and among civilians. Bleeding gums, loose teeth, and the slow reopening of old wounds were the signs of a body starved of fresh food, and these folk acids were the only countermeasure. The pharmacopoeia of hunger. Hunger is a disease, and the unconventional diet was inseparable from an unconventional pharmacopoeia. The same foraging for food became a foraging for medicine, as conventional drugs like quinine for malaria and opiates disappeared into the blockade. The pine tree was a drugstore. The inner bark of the pine was not just a famine food, it was chewed to prevent scurvy. Pine needle tea, made by steeping the green needles of the white pine, was rich in vitamin C. It tasted of turpentine and resin, a sharp, medicinal flavor that soldiers came to associate with staving off the dreaded swamp sickness and joint pain. Pine resin was the universal antiseptic. A wound would be packed with the sticky, golden sap, which sealed it from the air and had genuine antibacterial properties. Chewing the hardened resin, called rosin, was a habit among the hungry, a way to keep the mouth busy and, perhaps, to deliver some medicinal volatile oils to the system. The chinaberry tree, an import now widespread, was a source of a toxic, desperate medicine. The berries were mashed and used to make a salve for skin parasites like lice and scabies, which were rampant. Ingesting a decoction of chinaberry was a known poison, but a tiny, carefully measured amount was used to purge the system of intestinal worms, a common misery from a diet of undercooked vermin and dirty water. The line between a therapeutic purge and a fatal poisoning was thin. Red clay, particularly the kaolin clay eaten for hunger, had a secondary, real medicinal use. It was the active ingredient in the era's patent medicines for dysentery. The fine white clay particles absorbed the bacterial toxins in the gut. So, eating dirt, while a sign of terminal hunger, was also a folk treatment for the bloody flux that could kill a man in days. The clay, mixed with water and a little sassafras tea for flavor, was a homemade kaopectate. It didn't cure the infection, but it bought time and reduced the lethal dehydration. The Jimson weed and the morning glory seed were the escape drugs. In the prison camps and the demoralized winter camps, men would consume small quantities of Jimson weed seeds or morning glory seeds, both containing alkaloids similar to belladonna and LSD respectively. The resulting state was a multi-day psychosis, a trip of vivid hallucinations, complete disconnection from reality, and often permanent brain damage. This was not recreation. It was a deliberate, chemical obliteration of the reality of slow starvation. The psychological weight of the unconventional meal. The story cannot end with just a list of ingredients. The eating of these things changed people. The act of consuming a rat, a mule, a handful of clay, or a soup made from boot leather inflicted a psychological wound. It was an erosion of identity. For a yeoman farmer from Alabama, his self-worth was tied to his land and his hogs. To be reduced to eating a possum, an animal he had previously considered a pest, was an admission of his new place in the world. For an enslaved person, the post-war era was supposed to mean freedom from the master's scraps, but here, in the chaos of war, they were often reduced to the same wild foraging as the poorest whites, yet without the gun to hunt larger game. Their deep knowledge of wild edibles, once a supplement, became their entire food system, while they watched Confederate commissary agents seize their masters' remaining stores. The food of the wild was a double-edged sword. It kept them alive, but it was also a mark of their continued deprivation. The Union soldier, too, faced his own version. The immense industrial might of the North meant he was usually fed, but the food was a monotony of cured pork and hard crackers. This drove him to forage with a different desperation, not for survival, but for novelty, for something fresh and green. The kush, made from his own rations, was a creative act, a fight against the machine-like deadness of the official diet. But when he was cut off, at Chickamauga or in a rebel prison, his fall was harder, from industrial plenty to nothing, and his turn to the same rats and bark was filled with a shock of disbelief that a nation so rich could let him starve. The civilians in the path of Sherman's March or Sheridan's Shenandoah Valley campaigns saw their entire food world incinerated. Their smokehouses were pulled down, their fields burned, their livestock shot in their pens and left to rot as a deliberate act of economic warfare. The women and children left behind turned to the burnt corn, the charred kernels scraped from the ruins of the barn, ground, and mixed with water. They ate the dead animals from the field until the putrefaction was too advanced, and then they ate the weeds that grew in the ashes. This was a food system deliberately bombed back to a pre-agricultural state, and the psychological trauma of that, the memory of eating ash-covered, half-decayed mule meat, would define the bitterness of Reconstruction. The memory and the aftermath. The generation that survived the Civil War on these unconventional foods carried the memory in their bodies and their culture. The dishes that emerged in the impoverished post-war South were a direct, unbroken line from the war's desperation. The widespread consumption of chitlins and pig's feet in the soul food tradition was not a sudden invention. It was a continuity, a food of necessity that had become a cultural marker. The taste for highly seasoned, long-cooked greens, the pot liquor that was drunk for its vitamins, the reliance on cornbread and sorghum syrup, these were the peacetime echoes of wartime survival mechanisms. But there were other, darker physical legacies. The generation that had eaten dirt, particularly the kale and clay, suffered from severe intestinal disorders for the rest of their lives, chronic constipation, rectal prolapses, and the long-term effects of mineral imbalances. The pellagra that would later sweep the South, the niacin deficiency disease from a corn-dependent diet, had its seeds planted in the war years, when the diet narrowed to almost pure, unenriched cornmeal, devoid of the fresh meat and vegetables that had previously rounded out the meal. The war's food experimentation prefigured the malnutrition diseases of the post-war sharecropping economy. The psychological scars were a silence. Veterans did not easily tell their children about eating rat. They didn't describe the taste of a weevil-filled cracker or the texture of boiled leather. That knowledge was too dark. It survived in fragments, in the odd, bitter jokes that made no sense to the next generation, in the sudden, fierce hoarding of food, in the way a grandmother would never, ever throw away a potato peel or a chicken bone. That was the language of having starved. The old ways of processing acorns, of making sassafras tea, of finding wild greens, were still taught, but the original context, the raw, total hunger of the 1860s, was slowly erased, replaced by nostalgia for a simpler, self-sufficient past. Yet the physical record remains. At the site of the Andersonville prison, the soil is still marked. The very dirt the men ate, the kaolin clay, is visible as a layer in the archaeological record. In the fossilized human feces found in the latrines of both Union and Confederate camps, archaeologists can read the menu of desperation. They find the tiny bones of blackbirds and minnows, the seeds of pokeberries and blackberries, the fragments of acorn shell, the gritty, undigestible silica of corn shucks, and the telltale chemical signature of clay. The story is written in the earth, a direct, unromantic script of what they put in their mouths when there was nothing else. This account, then, is not a celebration of ingenuity. It is a documentation of a system. Failure. The unconventional foods of the Civil War are not a cookbook. They are a ledger of loss, a testament to what the human body can, for a time, endure, and a permanent imprint of a nation's self-inflicted wound on the palate and the gut of its people. Starvation as strategy and the end of the edible world. The unconventional foods of the Civil War did not just happen. They were not a natural disaster that fell equally upon all. By the war's final year, starvation itself had become a weapon, a deliberate military and political strategy. The food system of the Confederacy was not just blockaded, it was hunted, burned, and systematically dismantled by Union armies. And within the Confederacy, the food that did exist was apportioned along brutal lines of class and race, creating a hierarchy of hunger that pushed the most vulnerable to the very edge of the edible world. The burning of the breadbasket. Sherman's march to the sea and Sheridan's campaign in the Shenandoah Valley were not just military operations. They were a comprehensive destruction of the Southern food supply. The orders were explicit and total. Crops in the field, whether corn, wheat, or cotton, were put to the torch. Barns filled with the previous year's harvest were burned. Smokehouses were pulled down and their contents, the hams and shoulders and sides of bacon that represented years of labor, were either taken by the army or thrown into the flames. Livestock was slaughtered, not just the army's needed beef and hogs, but every animal. Cows, sheep, chickens, turkeys. Those that could not be driven along with the army were shot in their pens and left to rot. Mills, the mechanical stomach of the agricultural world, were dismantled, their stones broken, their wheels burned. This was not collateral damage. This was the deliberate creation of a food desert on a continental scale. The goal was to starve the Confederate armies in the field, to make it impossible for them to subsist off the land. But the immediate and intended victim was the civilian population. Women, children, the elderly, and the enslaved were left in a landscape of ash and carcasses. The unconventional foods of this final phase were the foods of a bombed-out world. The burnt corn became a primary starch. After a barn was torched, the corn crib was often a pile of smoldering, charred kernels. These were raked from the ashes, black and hard and tasting of smoke and fire. They were ground as best they could be, often in a hand mill that had been hidden from the soldiers. The resulting meal was gray-black, speckled with charcoal. The bread made from it was dense, bitter, and gritty, a physical ingestion of the destruction itself. The carcasses of the shot livestock were the only source of meat. In the days after an army passed, the countryside was a charnel house. The air was thick with the smell of decaying animals. The survivors, in a state of shock, moved among the dead animals, cutting away what meat was still fresh enough. This was a race against putrefaction. The meat was cut into strips and smoked over the smoldering ruins of the barn, a desperate attempt to preserve anything for the coming months. The taste of this meat was tainted, not just by the beginnings of decay, but by the psychological weight of eating the animals that had been part of the family's life. The fields themselves were scoured for anything that had survived the flames. The volunteer plants became the crop. Wheat and rye that had self-seeded from the previous harvest, growing wild in the ditches and the edges of the burned fields, were carefully, individually harvested. This was a pitiful yield, a few handfuls of grain from a day's labor. The roots of wild plants, previously a supplement, became the main course. The tuber of the morning glory, a tough, fibrous, slightly psychoactive root, was dug and boiled. The root of the bull thistle, a large, spiky weed, was peeled and eaten raw or cooked, a watery, slightly sweet and extremely fibrous food. The root of the daylily, a common garden escape, was dug, the small tubers washed and boiled into a starchy, bland paste. The hierarchy of hunger in the collapsing Confederacy. As the conventional food supply collapsed, the Confederacy itself became an engine of starvation for its own people. The government's policy was to feed the army first at all costs. Commissary agents, often armed with impressment laws, swept through the countryside, seizing grain, livestock, and even the stored food of individual families. They paid in Confederate currency, which was rapidly becoming worthless. This was not a purchase, it was confiscation. The farmers, particularly the yeoman farmers who did not have large plantations, were left with nothing. Their resentment, their sense of betrayal by their own government, was a major factor in the collapse of Southern morale. The class divide in hunger became a chasm. The wealthy, particularly those with access to blockade-run goods, could still obtain real coffee, white flour, sugar, and canned goods from Europe. The starvation parties of Richmond were a grotesque performance of normality by a class that still had access to hidden stores. But the poor whites of the cities and the countryside were thrown back on the full spectrum of unconventional foods. The bread riots of Richmond in 1863 were not just about the price of food, they were a scream of rage from women who had been pushed past the unconventional, past the acorn flour and the poke salad, into absolute, grinding hunger. They marched, they looted, and they demanded that the government acknowledge their starvation. For the enslaved population, the war's food crisis was layered on top of an already oppressive system. Before the war, the enslaved diet was a calculated ration, designed to provide enough calories for labor but not a surplus for health or pleasure. It was cornmeal and salt pork, often the poorest cuts. During the war, as the master's stores dwindled, the enslaved rations were the first to be cut. The enslaved were forced to rely even more heavily on their own garden plots, their own foraging, their own deep knowledge of the wild edible landscape. But they had less time to work their own gardens, less access to guns for hunting, and less freedom to range far from the plantation. Their unconventional diet was not an adventure in survivalist creativity. It was a tightening vice of deprivation, managed by a system that still demanded their labor. When Union armies approached, the situation became even more complex. Some masters fled, leaving them enslaved to fend for themselves in a destroyed landscape. Some took their enslaved people with them on a refugeeing journey into the interior, where food was even scarcer. The enslaved who escaped to Union lines found a new form of food dependency in the contraband camps, where rations were irregular and disease was rampant. The unconventional foods of the contraband camps were the same as those of the army camps, hardtack and salt pork, but doled out with even less regularity, supplemented by foraging in unfamiliar territory. The final menu. The prison camps of both sides, but most notoriously the Confederate camp at Andersonville, Georgia, and the Union camp at Elmira, New York, represent the absolute end of the unconventional food spectrum. Here, the food system was reduced to its most elemental and most murderous form. Andersonville was not designed to starve men. It was designed to hold them, and the Confederate government, itself starving, could not or would not provide the food to keep them alive. The official ration, when it was delivered, was a small amount of coarse, unbolted cornmeal, often moldy, a few ounces of meat, often the rancorous parts of a diseased animal, and a pinch of salt. But this ration was frequently not delivered at all, or delivered in such reduced quantities that it was a mockery of sustenance. The men inside Andersonville created a complete internal food economy, a savage parody of a market. Everything became food and everything had a price. The rats that infested the camp were a delicacy, worth money or tobacco. The men organized rat hunts, using traps made from scraps of wood and wire. The captured rats were skinned, gutted, and roasted over small, furtive fires. The taste, survivors reported, was like squirrel if you could get past the idea of what you were eating. But many could not. The psychological barrier was immense, and some men simply starved rather than eat a rat. The stream that ran through the camp, Stockade Creek, was the water source and the sewer. It was a slow brown trickle of filth. But in its muddy banks, there were crawfish, small and scrawny. These were caught by hand, boiled in a tin cup if a man had one, or eaten raw. The creek also provided a kind of green scum, an algae that grew on the surface. Some men skimmed this off and ate it, a desperate attempt to get something green, something fresh, into their bodies. It often caused violent diarrhea, which, in a camp with no sanitation, was a death sentence. The most extreme food in Andersonville was the one that was not an animal or a plant. It was the grease that came from cooking the official rations. When the cornmeal and the scrap of meat were boiled together, a thin film of fat would rise to the surface. This was carefully skimmed off and saved. It was a precious substance, caloric and slightly flavored. Men would trade other items for a spoonful of this grease to add to their cornmeal. It was the ghost of animal fat, the last whisper of the hog. When the official rations stopped entirely, for days at a time, the men turned to the earth itself. The white clay of the Georgia soil, the kaolin, was dug from the hillside and eaten. It had no nutritional value. It was pure mineral. But it filled the stomach, briefly silencing the maddening pangs of hunger. The men who ate the clay became a common sight, their bellies distended, their faces gaunt, a grotesque parody of a full stomach. The clay caused intestinal blockages that were often fatal. The camp surgeons, themselves under-resourced, could do nothing. The clay eaters died in the thousands, their digestive systems packed with dirt. At the Union camp at Elmira, in upstate New York, the situation was different in cause but similar in effect. The camp was deliberately punitive. The commandant, furious at reports of mistreated Union prisoners in the South, ordered retaliation. The rations were cut. The barracks were unheated. The winter of 1864 to 1865 was brutal. The men at Elmira did not eat clay. They ate the bark of the trees inside the stockade. They boiled their shoes, the leather providing a thin, foul broth. They caught and ate the rats that lived under the barracks. They scavenged the garbage from the guards' mess, fighting each other for potato peelings and bone scraps. The death rate at Elmira was nearly as high as at Andersonville, a fact that was deliberately obscured after the war. The psychological state of a man eating these things is almost impossible to fully reconstruct. The diaries and letters that survive speak of a kind of dissociation. The act of eating a rat, of chewing a piece of boiled leather, of swallowing a mouthful of white dirt, was not experienced as eating. It was experienced as a mechanical operation, a grim necessity performed by a body that no longer felt like one's own. The pleasure of food, the social and cultural meanings of a meal, were completely obliterated. What remained was the bare animal imperative. Put something, anything, into the hole in your face or die. Death, disease, and the scarred generation. The unconventional foods of the Civil War did not just keep people alive. They also killed, slowly and painfully. The diseases that swept through the armies and the civilian populations were not just the result of bad sanitation and crowded conditions. They were dietary diseases, the direct consequence of the body being forced to process substances it was never designed to consume. Chronic diarrhea and dysentery were the great killers of the war, claiming more lives than bullets. The official number is staggering. Over 44,000 Union soldiers died of diarrhea and dysentery. The Confederate numbers, though less complete, were proportionally even higher. This was not a single disease. It was a syndrome, a catastrophic failure of the digestive system. The causes were multiple. The constant consumption of coarse, unbolted cornmeal, with its sharp, indigestible hulls, scraped the lining of the intestines. The rancid, decayed meat introduced a constant stream of bacteria. The wild greens, foraged from contaminated ground and washed in contaminated water, carried parasites. The clay, eaten to stave off hunger, provided a perfect surface for bacterial growth in the gut. The lack of fresh vegetables and fruits meant a complete absence of the vitamins that maintain the integrity of the intestinal lining. The soldier's gut was a battleground, constantly inflamed, constantly leaking fluids, and eventually unable to absorb any nutrition at all. A man with chronic diarrhea was starving even as he ate, his body flushing away. Interviews to historians about the texture of boiled leather or the taste of roasted rat. They carried the knowledge in their bodies, in their damaged guts and their prematurely aged faces, but they did not speak it. Their children and grandchildren, growing up in a South that was building a new mythology of the lost cause, a romanticized vision of the war, did not want to hear about the clay eating. They wanted to hear about the bravery, the sacrifice, the honor. The hunger did not fit the story. But the story remains, written in the archaeological record, in the bones of the dead, and in the few, stark diaries that were not burned or lost. It is a story that must be told without romance, without the easy comfort of calling it ingenuity. It was not ingenuity. It was trauma. The people who ate these things were not adventurous eaters exploring the boundaries of cuisine. They were human beings in a system that had failed them completely, a system that had turned their stomachs into a final battlefield. The unconventional foods of the American Civil War are a mirror held up to the conflict itself. The ersatz coffee and the acorn flour are the blockade. The burnt corn and the carcass meat are the march to the sea. The rat on the stick and the white clay are the prison camp. To understand what they ate is to understand the war, not as a sequence of battles and generals, but as a physical, bodily experience that touched every person in the nation, from the highest general to the most forgotten enslaved child. It is the story of how a nation ate itself, and the taste of that meal lingered for generations.